Hello and welcome. You're listening to The Power Reclamation Show, where we explore the mysteries, heartbreaks, and resiliency of the human experience. Together, we'll focus on rewilding ourselves through raising consciousness and dismantling domestication. This is a collective journey of challenging hierarchical systems of power over, as well as our own personal conditioning and limiting belief systems. This show is about embodying the power of love, presence, and our own inner authority. Today's episode is focused on the gateway from my power reclamation system called Wild Power. Wild Power is defined as your devotion to the passionate roar within you that has the power to challenge the status quo, dismantle social and cultural domestication, and ultimately shred any box or cage that's imprisoning you. This is really a journey of reclaiming ourselves from the inside out. And all of this serves you in your journey of reclaiming your authentic, free, and sovereign life, which is led by love and compassion rather than by fear, scarcity, or blind compliance. And if you're familiar with my power reclamation system, you'll recall there are 6 gateways to travel through as we remember and integrate our wholeness. And each one serves as a portal to explore unintegrated parts of ourselves. In other words, it's a map to reveal both our gifts and our shadows, and the places where we hide, or the places that we puff up, or even, I see in myself, the places that I'm striving to prove something, or when I collapse to avoid the unknown, or when I feel like something isn't going in my favor and I lose agency. This is how we come home. And this is how we create a world void of war, greed, power over, and domesticating forms of domination. We turn towards the most scary and undesirable parts of ourselves to find inner peace and unshakable power. The Wild Power theme today is about the superhuman compulsion of busyness, striving, competing, and doing. What does it mean to dismantle the stronghold of limiting beliefs that drive behaviors of disembodied striving and doing? And in the midst of all the fear, anxiety, or propensity towards striving, what does it mean if we turn our attention towards the power of our awareness, the presence of our being? And I'm talking about the state of being that encompasses an open mind, an open heart, and a perception of reality that orients towards the complexity of change, the difficulty of disappointment, and eradicates emotional states with curiosity and welcoming. I'm talking about the state of being that's devoted to living within swaths of uncertainty while managing the patterns of anxiety that tend to drive our behaviors of controlling, complying, or even defending against differences. So whether you're a business leader, an entrepreneur, a coach, or a healer, you have the ability to lead through the power of your presence and to not leave any aspect of your brilliant mind, your open heart, or your intuition behind. But you know what's so ironic about all of this is the world isn't really set up for this type of success, to feel effortless and to feel natural. You've likely already noticed this, and as a result, you've devoted yourself to the path of self-awareness and expansion of your consciousness to open into the most compassionate heart you can have. You may also have discovered, like me, that the power of your presence and your ability to listen deeply, manage your own reactivity, and notice when you're in defensive patterns of fight, flight, or freeze are actually necessary in order to break from the confines of a domesticated life, to break free from the beliefs and behaviors that have become habituated and normalized simply just to keep you safe. We all do this. And so the power of looking inward and actually taking ownership for this, I think, is one of the biggest ways to break the cycle. And my journey with this, it's ongoing and it's hard won. And I find that it's less often more of a tectonic heat plate shift and more often through these small incremental shifts that happen within my perception of reality and my place in that perception of reality. So another way to say this is that it's really the discovery of your and my value, that it's not just found in what we do and what we achieve, but just as significantly, it's found, maybe even more so actually, in who we're becoming. So for me, it takes bootstrapping courage to challenge my own beliefs, and to reveal the aspects of myself that I've banished and that I've stuffed into the shadows because, quite honestly, they simply don't fit into the idealized self that I'm trying to portray, even more probably to myself than even to the external world of who I think I'm supposed to be. That persona of, I want you to see me. I want you to see the dazzling parts of me. I want the world to acknowledge and celebrate me. And there's nothing wrong with wanting this. It's a primal need. We want to feel seen. We need to feel seen. And we want to know that we belong. And we want to know that our life matters. So there's nothing wrong with the movements towards these places. It's just how much are we identified with them. So I imagine you know what I'm talking about. So I'll ask you the same question. Who are you wanting people to see when they perceive you? Your protective patterns or the real you? The charming, charismatic one that says all the right things, but inside is somehow betraying either yourself or other people? The people pleaser that caretakes everyone else, but at the end of the day, resentment builds because you haven't set boundaries? Who are we really wanting to be known for? These protective patterns that are born from fear, or the most authentic self we can bring? And so, do you dare to reach towards a safe enough environment that encourages and allows you to touch into the banished aspects of yourself? And then let these parts sing their song, dance their awkward dances, and rest into the anxious hum of being a sensitive human in an increasingly chaotic and loud world. I don't believe we're meant to be perfect and whole. I believe that we are meant for wholeness through integrating and bringing these parts and these aspects of our power back into our own awareness, and I would say our loving awareness. We're not meant to be self-sufficient robots with embedded coding programmed to ensure that we perform as a superstar. Because if we don't, the game confirms a deeply distorted truth that we're unworthy. We're unworthy of love, inspiration, passion, and purpose. And I just don't believe that to be true. I think we are meant to have superpowers that are our unique offerings to life, and many of which have been buried like treasures that we set out to mine for and polish with a welcoming heart and mind. Ultimately, we're not meant to do it all or be it all, nor are we meant to improve and fix all our perceived shortcomings. And why? Why is that true? Well, two reasons come to mind for me. I think we are interconnected, and I think we also have blind spots and a traumatic inheritance. So let me just share a little bit about both of those. I think that we're interconnected fractals of the whole. We are interdependent beings with unique superpowers that are meant to leverage and highlight those around us, not to knock them down. And we need to own our power so that we can contribute to the collective with our piece of the puzzle. We're here to acknowledge in our hearts that we are dependent upon one another in order to shine, rather than we have to eliminate or humiliate or even criticize someone who threatens our internalized scripts, the parts that tell us that we're inferior or that we're superior or that somehow our worthiness is based on people's perception of us. I think it's only our internalized belief systems that actually have the power to package ourselves as less than, and thereby they cause us to either collapse into shame or to rise with our boxing gloves and fight. I don't believe that winning requires anyone to conquer another person, animal, plot of land, or country. Leaving others crucified and left in the dust is not an indicator of wholeness. It's an indicator of a lost soul operating through greed, fear, and heaps of unworthiness. No one wins with this form of separation. So that's one reason why we're not meant to do it all, is that we inherently are built into a framework where we are dependent on one another. We do need to share our gifts so that we can leverage other people's gifts. And then the second that I mentioned are just blind spots, traumatic inheritance. We are designed with blind spots, which really occur through having a conditioned mind and even unresolved trauma imprints that both were born from our personal lives, but also come from lifetimes of our ancestors. And we could retrace this back through our family lineage and the trauma from that space and time, but also the ancestors of all of creation here on planet Earth, starting with this single small protozoa that was floating in pools of water that began the whole journey of evolution. These parts of our inheritance are meant to be befriended, not exiled, and not used as ammunition to assault ourselves or criticize and attack others who also live with the same imprint of a conditioned self who's actually forgotten their oneness with all of life, with all of creation. I believe we're here to leverage, draw out, and celebrate one another's unique superpowers, not to stomp on them in hopes of making ourselves feel or look better, and not to shrink or stay small and fear that we're not enough. When we deny our own superpowers because they don't look like a celebrity or an acclaimed writer, athlete, or inspiring leader, we hold ourselves back. And we don't do this on purpose. There's an innocence to puffing ourselves up, and there's an innocence to collapsing. And that's what needs our attention. Your superpowers and your contributions, they're not meant to look like anyone else's. They're meant to be your unique signature of creation and love. And how you express this is your journey of embodiment and self-acceptance. We actually really need each other to activate our gifts and to welcome our pockets of shame, fear, and the internalized narratives of superiority and inferiority. As a child, my favorite superheroes were the Wonder Twins. You may remember them. But in case this dynamic duo is unfamiliar to you, here's a recap. Zane and Jaina are twins from an extraterrestrial race called Exorion. Orphaned by a plague that killed their parents, the twin and brother-sister were adopted into an intergalactic circus as unpaid performers. They were domesticated as slaves, and they were also seeking freedom. Neither of them could do this alone. They actually needed each other to activate their special powers. And they did this by touching knuckles and speaking the phrase, "Wonder Twin powers, activate. Make me into a form of..." And then Jaina would shapeshift into an animal, while Zane, the brother, would shapeshift into some form of water, whether that was liquid, ice, steam, mist. I remember one time he shapeshifted into a cage made of ice and an igloo. Sometimes he was a sled. So as a child, I secretly wished that I was the sister Jaina too, because I wanted the powers to become any kind of animal when I felt threatened or in danger. But eventually the Wonder Twins escaped the circus in pursuit of their own mission to be of service on planet Earth. And upon learning of a dark villain's scheme to destroy Earth, they traveled in their spaceship to warn Earthlings of the impending danger. And shortly after arrival, they joined the League of Justice and the Super Friends and lent their shape-shifting superpowers to assist in the fight against villains and criminals. This story is so endearing to me because it really highlights how they made it through by bringing both of their unique superpowers to any situation and being there together and activating one another. They couldn't have done it. Like the powers stayed dormant without activating together. I genuinely believe that each one of us does have a superpower and a special medicine. So I wonder, what are your superpowers? Does your life allow you to access and cultivate these special powers with others? I think sometimes our superpowers are actually invisible to us, yet ironically, they are an unshakable aspect of our design. For example, if you're blessed with the gift of empathetic listening, or running big numbers in your head without a calculator, or even sensing energy shifts in people and places without words being spoken, or maybe you embody a coveted capacity to surrender into the uncertainty instead of becoming frantic and paralyzed by fear. Whatever it is, each time we give and receive appreciation for one another's superpowers, we help each other deepen and embody them more. In many indigenous tribes, when a child's born, the shaman will read the medicine of the young one's destiny. And from that day forward, each member of the tribe is devoted to fostering this child's gifts and empowering them to live into the fullness of his or her authentic path. There's no manipulation to change the child into who a tribal member wants them to be. And the parents, well, they're encouraged to relinquish any desire to persuade or control the child's interests. And since the tribe doesn't operate like many Western family systems, in which children are often molded into who others want them to be, the children's gifts are not polluted by external agendas. And like a dusty gem, each tribe member polishes the child's destiny with celebration, tough love, encouragement, and curiosity. This form of love, acceptance, and nurturing another's being into their full blossom is a sacred art of honoring another's destiny. But regretfully, many modern-day systems of influence, family systems, education, peers, even some religions, have lost this art. And streams of conditioned expectations and fear-based messaging, pressures of who we need to become, take shape as early as infancy, long before we have the ability to self-reflect and make conscious choices. And instead of being mentored to become our most authentic self, many of us are praised when we follow what's expected of us, and then punished or shamed when we don't. This process forms a certain type of conditioning that muddies our internal waters, and it redirects our attention away from an internal orientation towards knowing who we are, and instead towards external seeking for validation, approval seeking. And as a result, we might strive towards culturally esteemed markers of success, such as productivity, attractiveness, popularity, even busyness, or accumulating material possessions, just to prove our value. Because often in this mindset, doing is far more important than being. I spoke in a previous podcast about 5 developmental phases of consciousness, or 5 developmental stages of leadership. And the first one is actually called egocentric, and it's defined as self-sovereign, which means everything is about getting my needs met. How are you going to meet my needs? What are you going to do for me? And this is really normal when a child is developing, into early adulthood, that everything is really oriented around me. And this is how we create a sense of being a separate self. And the next phase moves into what I refer to as reactive. And this phase is more of when we are really seeking our outer game. So it means we're looking externally to identify who we are and what our value is. And as a result, we're often trying to fix and uphold these idealizations of who we think we should be, even if they go against something quieter and deeper and more authentic inside of us. And then when we move through that second phase of reactive, we move towards the third, which is creative or authentic. And this is when we start to shift from the outer game of finding our value externally to the inner game of starting to recognize the power that lies within. And this is when we reveal to ourselves the particular strategies that we've drawn upon to protect ourselves. Because ultimately, those protections are really a way that we're just trying to get our needs met. And then that brings us to the next level, which is often referred to as integral. This is an integral phase where we're now taking everything that we have brought along the way, particularly in the last phase of the creative, authentic phase, where we're cultivating our inner game. Now we're taking this to more of an integral game where we're going much deeper into exploring what our blind spots are and embracing the shadows that live within us and those that live collectively in the systems that we participate in. So if you want to know more, you can listen to that previous episode. But the reason that I'm bringing it up now is because I think it's really important to recognize that this phenomenon of the superhuman compulsion, it's very much related to that phase, the reactive phase, where we are seeking our value externally. And we're seeking the validation through what we do rather than who we are deep within, our sense of presence, our being. So back to this phenomenon of superhuman compulsion, it's really this unrelenting drive to become someone who others will be proud of, or to free ourselves from self-doubt, fear of inadequacy, and chronic restlessness. You probably know that voice. It's like, as soon as I have that thing. It could be a partner, savings, or a home, or promotion, or some kind of recognition. Then I'll be happy. And often, when we possess the golden goose that we've been striving for, the joy quickly fades, compelling us to refocus our attention and strive towards the next idealization of happiness. I think that indoctrination and conditioning are the primary cause for this internalized severing from abiding inside of our own basic goodness. And if we don't repair the separation from our center of being, then most of our actions will be driven by anxiety, some story around our inadequacy, and the lack that we feel inside. And so instead, we're striving for a self-image of who we think we need to be to become happy, loved, and valued. So the way to course correct domesticating ourselves and one another is to collectively dismantle the programming that we've inherited, and to shred the tightly bound packages that confine us. And believe me, this is not an easy path, and it requires us to access our superpowers, our ability to expand, our capacity to hold complexity, hold polarizing beliefs, hold double binds or conflicting needs that live within us. And that's also conflicting perspectives about ourselves or others. And this is really a time when we're cultivating the deep skills of listening to ourselves, listening to the contradictions within us, and finding a way to bring those into our awareness more wholeheartedly. Because once we do that, we can start understanding the impact that they're having on us and the impact they're having on everyone around us in the whole. So really looking at what are our actions, beliefs, and needs that keep throwing us, derailing us, causing us to separate even from ourselves. Today, I want to focus on this paradigm of the superhuman compulsion, this socially esteemed and even normalized way of operating that often requires us to neglect our needs, especially our need for rest, sleep, connection, play, and self-care, in order to sustain this self-image of being competent, valuable, and responsible, the superhuman woman or superhuman man. So depending on our conditioning and our soul curriculum, some of us will rebel against this, while others will innocently succumb to the conditioning and the beliefs that the only way through is to do more, strive more, work harder, give up our needs, and hope that someday we'll find a rest stop or a finish line. I know that myself. I know that in my early 20s, I knew no other way. All I had my sights on, and it wasn't even a conscious thought, was just doing more, striving more, achieving more, that somehow I didn't realize consciously at the time, I actually really thought that would make me happy. And there's another path some people take where they will hunker down quietly and forge ahead as martyrs, trapped somewhere in the belief that they are the only one that can do it, that they are the one responsible for making everything happen, and that they can't actually relinquish any of their duties of being the hard worker and the one that holds it all together. Because if they did so, then they would be disloyal. But at the same time, they complain and feel like there's a quality of martyrdom, and they choose to endure or numb out and slowly die inside. It's painful, no matter what path we're taking. And these are just 3 examples of different paths we can go. The shared operating agreement within any of these is just that there's a separation from self. And in the Western culture, we prize being a superhuman. From a really early, young age, many of us are indoctrinated by a cultural and social pressure to reach our highest potential. You even hear, like, hit your life out of the park, even at the expense of our own authentic desires. And like me, in my early 20s, at the expense of my own health and my emotional well-being. How many of us have learned that our value is crystallized only after we have achieved the esteemed social life, the perfect job, the perfect family, the perfect body, or the perfect and healthy lifestyle? I think these pressures whisk us away on a roller coaster ride of highs and lows. One day we feel accomplished, successful, and worthy, and then another day we collapse into depression, unworthiness, and feelings of self-doubt and failure. And when we're bombarded with social pressures of who we need to become, it's really easy to forget who we are at our core and to forget what our life's purpose is. I know that I tried with a fervent devotion to maintain my superhuman status until I was 32 years old, and I collapsed into a 6-year illness. Not only did this healing crisis demand me to stop all my activity, but it allowed me the space to excruciatingly expose the conditioned beliefs, behaviors, and brainwashing that I had internalized. And finally, after digging deep enough into the roots, I identified the sources of fuel that had driven me into burnout and adrenal fatigue. I wonder, do you recognize a frenetic voice of anxiety that whips your attention, often in the middle of the night towards your ballooning to-do list or the problems that you need to solve? You know, that voice that promises, well, once things are accomplished, or in my case, once they're solved, then you can rest. Don't buy it. That's what I've had to tell myself over and over again. This is a trap. And if you're like me, no matter how efficient you are, there'll always be more. So let's be honest. Some of our to-do lists, they're so exhaustive that we would need to remain awake 24 hours a day just to accomplish a fraction of it. And if we're lucky, we're left with some time to exercise, rest, prioritize our practice, and spend time with the people we love. But paradoxically, even those sources of nourishment can become another task on our to-do list. Are we even present when we're engaged in those activities? Or are we still spinning in our to-do lists in our heads? I want to pause here and just to take a brief inventory. And I'm going to read you just a couple of questions. And so if you're not driving or you have an opportunity to just slow down here and close your eyes, I just invite you to do so as I read 4 questions that I have written down. And just see how many of these resonate for you. After a long day of chipping away at your to-do list, do you collapse into bed from pure exhaustion and then just wake up and do it all over again? Or is your health declining no matter how well you eat or no matter how often you go to the gym? Is your need to numb out through various addictions increasing over time? Like, are you binging on Netflix? Are you binging on alcohol, sugar, or socializing? What are you doing to manage the overwhelm? And the last one is, do you find yourself preferring to stay up late or rise early in the morning just so that you can find some glimmer of nourishment or something that allows your system to settle and feel like you've been able to actually feed yourself? Because during the day, there doesn't seem like there's any time for that or for you. So just notice if any of those have any resonance, or maybe as I say them, you can think through, what are the ways that you tend to disconnect from your own authentic self, where you find that you're just on a treadmill and there's really no space for you to be with you? And how do you deal with that? What are your ways of self-soothing? And the only reason I bring this up is not because any of this is wrong, but because it's so important for us to know how we're trying to tend to the disconnection that we can sometimes feel when we're trapped in an idea of who we think we should be, and the loss of passion and purpose and depression that can rise when there's a disconnection from our deeper self. I think when we're living under a constant pressure to uphold the expectations of being superhuman, that there's a quick route to drying up our well of passion and resiliency. And if we're preoccupied with who we think we need to become, then we may actually miss the boat and wonder, who are we actually when we're not stressed and striving? Who are we when we feel pressured and under-resourced, and we have less to give and more easily reactive towards others? We may even surprise ourselves with frequent outbursts of our hot anger. Or maybe even over time, we become less curious. And maybe we even forget, we stop checking assumptions, and instead we build stories and narratives about others that cause more disconnection, or even stories about ourselves. Or maybe we find that instead we look for someone to blame for our states of anxiety and overwhelm. I've even had to track in myself a loss of agency, where sometimes I can collapse into hopelessness or despair or self-doubt because I feel uninspired. I feel inspired sometimes by the activities or the things that I think are supposed to bring me joy that no longer do. So unless our mind and body become replenished, it's very common for these chronic states of anxiety, depression, and even stress to manifest into physical illness or disease. I think that one of the most common causes of burnout is actually the pressure to keep pace with these expectations, and that as a result, it pushes us beyond our capacity and beyond our natural rhythms. And I know for myself, I have all sorts of ways that I can bargain with myself in these situations and really justify why I need to keep going. But I'll tell you this, you are not meant to do everything. And I really think that illness related to burnout is an epidemic, and that many people, families, organizations are investing significant resources to prevent this by practicing mindfulness, learning how to set boundaries, and really embracing the tools that help us to build resilience. And with conscious awareness, we can expose the slave driver. We can expose the one who rejects our need for rest, our need for play, intimacy, connection, and the part that has us enduring. We need to prioritize feeling loved, nurtured, inspired. So do you know what your North Star is? And where do you orient to find contentment and satisfaction with the busyness of life? So in this episode, I want to break down the root cause behind the superhuman paradigm and how to dismantle its grip over us in an attempt to embody a liberated, passionate, and authentic life. So I think we begin by understanding our collective inheritance. And really, this is also a conversation about moving from the outer game to the inner game. And so again, I referred to that earlier, that outer game where we are orienting from a belief that our value is based on the perception of what others will think when we do X, Y, and Z. And the inner game is when we start to challenge those beliefs and start actually having the courage to turn towards what's more authentic and true for us. I think as a culture, particularly in the Western culture here in the United States, that we've learned to manage high states of anxiety through distractions and addictions. We've learned to consume substances, people, food, achievements, all in the name of creating some sense of satisfaction, resiliency. It's almost like we're under the spell of a collective belief that happiness and peace reside somewhere outside of us, somewhere in the next relationship, somewhere in that next achievement, somewhere even in that next spiritual insight, or the next rung on our glorified ladder of success. I think over a millennia, we've been indoctrinated to seek freedom and validation externally instead of internally, which forces us to forfeit an intimate relationship with the sensitive and attuned instrument of our whole being wisdom. So that's not just the intelligence of our mind, but really the intelligence of our heart, our gut feelings, the power of understanding information through tracking our body sensations. We might even call this, the creative energy that rises through us, whether that becomes sexual or it gets channeled into creativity and visioning and business endeavors. That's an intelligence too. And I think many of us have lost connection to an inherent trust that when we really surrender and learn to rest and listen, the flow of life will carry us into the next thing. The next steps will be revealed. But I think instead of this, we've been taught that we have to fight. We have to fight hard and we have to push relentlessly to will our way into what we want. At least that's what I was taught. And it wasn't until the middle of a training that I took 10 years ago called Hakomi, when I remember the teacher gave us a statement and we were supposed to just feel in our body what it was like when we heard the statement. And so I'll do it now. And if you're in a place where you could just close your eyes for a moment, I just want you to notice when I share these words, what happens inside of you. Maybe you even have words in response to these words, or you have an emotion that rises. But just notice what happens when you hear, it's okay not to know. You'll know when you need to know. It's empowering just to give ourselves permission to play, even if we don't believe it, with the possibility that we don't have to figure it all out, that there's a larger wisdom guiding us. However we orient to that larger expanded field of wisdom is unique to all of us, but that we are not alone and that we are being guided and that the answers will come. And I think that knowing what it is that we long for is a starting point, being honest about what's working, being honest about what's not working and what we long for. I think that is what opens the door for us to receive more clarity and more guidance. I think it's really disempowering subtext message that can be in our culture, and I know embedded in my own psyche, that you don't slow down. You can't slow down, because if you do, you'll be left behind, you'll be passed up, you'll be forgotten. It's painful. I think sometimes underneath there's a subtext that logic and reason are actually safer than listening, trusting, and waiting for guidance. I think cultural and social norms are really invisible interferences, and until we investigate them, they truly rule our lives. There's a lot of power in understanding how we are conditioned and taking responsibility for tracking the way that that shows up within us. So I wonder again, how do you manage this quandary of being who you think you should be versus who you are yearning to become? It's a real question. Where are the places in us that are waiting to come alive that don't have the space or room because we're so attached and safe, staying in the, even if it's tight quarters, staying in the confined known reality that gives us a sense of safety, even when it doesn't feel nourishing anymore? I think as we expand our capacity to self-reflect and take ownership for these conditioned beliefs and behaviors, we truly open the gates for evolution and integration. And each time we consciously identify the internalized voices responsible for reinforcing these anxiety-based striving and superhuman idealizations, we reclaim aspects of our power. And many of us will toggle between internalized expectations of, strive to be your best, try harder, do more. And then the other side of the equation is, you're lazy. You're not living up to your full potential. You're not enough. You don't know what you're doing. You're a waste. And those polarized voices, they create an internal landlock of confusion, guilt, and depletion. And I want to share a couple more of common voices that we might hear that are imprinted within the superhuman paradigm. And I mentioned one of these earlier. It's that notion that as soon as I have X, and again, that could be a promotion or a baby or, capital for your business or a partner. Whenever I get that thing, then I'll be happy. Then I can relax and enjoy my life. That's one. Another is, I have to keep striving to be my best. I have to try harder. I have to do more. I have to keep going. And then maybe I'll rest. Maybe I'll rest later. But if I don't do all of this first, I will have failed and I'll prove that I'm inadequate. So inherent in that, there's just no time for rest. It's all doing, going, forcing. And I think another is, to fit in, I'm supposed to think or talk or look apart. I'm supposed to look a certain way. And if needed, I have to repress my own desires and become who others need me to be. Because the subtext is, it's more important that I'm accepted than being authentic. Because the cost of not belonging is too painful. Another that I just talked to the client about the other day is the envy that can occur when we're orienting our own value by looking at social media and seeing what other people are doing in the world. It might appear that they've got everything together. They've got all these people following them. And yet we don't know the backstory, first of all. And second, that comparison can make us feel so less than, and it can make us feel like we're falling behind or failing. And we all know what happens in these situations is that self-doubt and that inner critic will just take over. So I'm naming some of these because I think it's really important, as I mentioned earlier, to get acquainted with how it shows up in our own minds. Because it's really natural to have these thoughts. I think most of us have these internalized ways of perceiving ourselves in our lives, and I think a lot of times they're incredibly distorted. And that these messages are also perpetually reinforced, but they're detrimental to our mental, emotional, and physical well-being. So this superhuman compulsion phenomenon actually teaches us to mask our anxiety, to mask our self-doubt and our exhaustion and our overwhelm in order to save face and to not appear as if we're a fallen superhero. So as we come to this final wrapping up, I wanted to note two key factors that I think are responsible for fueling this superhuman compulsion. And of course, I've already named quite a few, and I've spoken to both of these in different ways, but I'm going to tease them out and build on them a little bit more. And the first one is seeking externally for validation, which again goes back to that level of development, whether we call it consciousness or leadership development, where the mind is still very oriented to who do I need to become to be loved, respected, belong, have power, and that it's an external seeking. And then the second is an addiction to busyness. So let's start with the seeking externally for validation. Our cultural norms have enforced order and control by really actually exiling aspects of our primal nature, aspects of our wildness. And in a way, we've inherited this collective story of fear and judgment and shame. And I think most of us swing between two extremes on a daily basis, of one being, I'm not enough, or another being, I'm too much. So I think we've been subconsciously brainwashed to locate ourselves within this hierarchical system of superiority and inferiority. And this results in games of I'm better than you or you're better than me. How many of us have invested in something out of fear and a need to improve ourselves for social standards instead of for our own joy and pleasure? This superhuman compulsion of seeking externally causes us to look outside for our sense of value, to our professional or financial success, our physical appearance, or the social circles that we run in. I think we're taught to identify with an espoused ideal of success, which is reinforced by a consumer-driven culture designed to propel us towards increased consumption and accumulation of material possessions. And when success is measured by external pressure to produce, prove, and accomplish, it's really easy to slide on a slippery slope into these anxiety-based striving, performing, pushing, and insecure comparisons that only spur us towards more divisive competition with each other. Here's the good news. I think that with self-awareness and discipline, we actually have the power to interrupt this cultural measuring stick of doing over being. I mean, think about it. How radical would it be to slow down and feel the power of our presence and show up with space and awareness and deep listening and curiosity? What would it be like if actually we led our businesses, we led our lives, we led our hearts from this place? And what if this inner game of present awareness and open-heartedness was our milestone, instead of these hoops that we jump through to impress others and to prove ourselves? The superhuman paradigm pushes us out of our bodies and into our rational mind. And there's nothing wrong with the brilliance of our mind, but what happens is if we're identified too much with something that doesn't include our body, then we're really depriving ourselves of these potent wells of wisdom that live within our primal intelligence, as I mentioned earlier, lives within our heart, in our gut feelings, in our intuition, in our instincts, in our senses. There's a sixth sense. We just know things sometimes, whatever we want to call that. If we're always in our mind using logic and reason, we miss half of that. So I wonder, before we move on to the second one of addiction to busyness, I want to do just a self-inquiry here around your relationship to seeking externally for validation. And I'm just going to read a couple of questions that I jotted down, and you can sit with what happens for you. And if you want to come back, you could even use this as a journaling exercise. So my first question is just a curiosity, more than anything, of how often do you sit quietly? Sit quietly and just listen to the voice of your own heart, maybe your intuition, or even just your body and your body awareness, your senses. And the second is, what are some of the ways that you make other people's perceptions of you more important than your own authentic needs or your own rhythm? And I can see this in myself sometimes when I know that as an introvert, I need time to rest. I need time to just be quiet. And I'm often on a business trip. I really want to be engaged with the people that I don't get to see very often. And so I'm teaching all day and I'm going to lunch with the group and I'm having dinner with the group. And after a couple of days, I feel that I'm actually overriding my authentic needs in order to make sure that I'm delivering. Because it's not as if I don't want to spend time with everyone. It's just that my system can only take so much in a moment's time. So how do we make other people's perception of us more important than our needs or our own rhythm? And really, I think those are the primary questions that I wanted to seed here. So wrapping that up, that's really the first place I think to track in terms of dismantling the superhuman compulsion is just to notice when we're seeking externally for validation, and how do we turn that towards ourselves and find what we're looking for within our own being. And the second one is the addiction to busyness. I think one of the most common and socially normalized addictions is busyness in our culture. People are praised for being busy. We wear as a badge of honor sometimes. Yeah, I was in the office early and I was the last one there. And, it can take shape in so many different ways. This addiction can take shape through stacking our lives with social engagements, work meetings, things that leave zero room to rest, no room to contemplate and connect with the information that's assimilating inside of us as we've been experiencing people and ideas and thoughts and even conflicts throughout the day. I think that defaulting to unconscious anxiety and stress responses can lead into addictive behaviors. Some forms of addictions actually carry a cultural negative stigma, such as substances, sex, shopping. And meanwhile, there are other forms of addictions that are revered in our culture, like workaholism, as I mentioned earlier, or relentlessly striving for success, recognition, pursuing the next material gain or the next spiritual experience. So I wonder, when does your busyness move from a compulsion to manage compounding anxieties and pressures? And when is it inspired from wholehearted passion and creative purpose? I know for myself, I really have to watch this edge because I have been conditioned to receive my worthiness by producing and to feel like my achievements were what made me feel okay about myself. And so I often have to look at when I'm creating out of a place of fear and when I'm creating out of a place of just unfettered love and passion. Because ultimately, we can't shift anything that we're not conscious of. And I think as children, many of us inherited voices that suggest being busy is more important than rest or connection or self-care or even building our reserves. Like building reserves, what? Resiliency, what? But now as adults, we realize that if we are going to be our most empowered self, we need to learn to regulate our nervous system, which means we need to know how to rest. And resting can look like taking 3 long breaths after being triggered in a business meeting. Resting isn't something that has to be complicated, but it does need attention, and we do need to know what our go-tos are in order to rest and reset our nervous system. I think for me, making space to self-inquire and to study myself has been a huge part of how I've been able to track the thoughts and behaviors that, for me, are associated with my addiction to busyness and my addiction to doing. So that wraps up the second, which is our addiction to busyness, which could be a whole conversation in and of itself. I want to round the corner here to finalize our conversation about how do we deconstruct the superhuman cage. And I think an antidote to doing so is to expose how we give our power away to the beliefs that live within us, the cultural beliefs, the social expectations, anything that causes us to feel shame and inadequate. Because at the end of the day, no one is meant to be superhuman. And to integrate and heal is to find acceptance for where we actually are without slipping into the quicksand of shame or revving our engines into more busyness to avoid painful feelings of unworthiness or perceived failure. I think when familiar patterns of anxiety and striving arise, we have a choice. The first is we habitually reinforce the strategies by continuing to draw upon whatever those are to manage our anxiety through whatever our form of busyness is, whatever our form of doing. So option 1 is we just continue to recapitulate the habit that's been wired in our brain of how to deal when the anxiety rises of unworthiness or whatever that threat response is that drives the busyness. The second option is all about what I do with clients. This is about slowing down, suspending our habitual responses, and actually investigating the thoughts and the beliefs that we unconsciously at most times reinforce as the way that we will seek externally for validation or pour ourselves into busyness. It's the seeking to slow down, suspend habit, and investigate the way that we operate with compassion that is the way through. I really think it's possible to generate states of well-being from the inside out rather than grasping for them externally. And I've devoted the last 20 years of my life to this very practice. I also know that it's possible to break down habituated addictions to busyness. And again, the journey begins with studying, tracking, and taking ownership for how the superhuman compulsion lives within us. I think a starting point is just expanding our self-awareness. I think slowing down, journaling, meditation, sometimes even having somebody hold space, whether it's a therapist or a coach or a friend, that can really listen to us process in a vulnerable way what it is that we're actually doing that's causing disruption in our lives. And I don't think much is possible until we're able to see and embrace what we are doing habitually and why we're doing it. Because before we can befriend our wounds and our distorted beliefs, we need to be able to see them. And then each time we expand our awareness, we do open these pathways to expose the beliefs. And once we see the map of how we've been operating, we're already deep inside the journey of rewilding ourselves. And also, another gateway that I talk about in my power reclamation system is self-acceptance. And I think that this process really amplifies the reclaiming of our wild power and our self-acceptance power. And actually, for that matter, our centering power. I think most of our beliefs are really drawn to make meaning out of the world, but also to protect our vulnerability, protect us from being exiled or rejected or abandoned. And that our internal operating system, it's not actually who we are. It is as a standalone mechanism of how behaviors and beliefs get played out in our lives, but it's not who we are. And so the more that we can learn how to manage the complexity of both being wired to connect and being wired to protect is where our freedom lies. And the more we're able to see our defense mechanisms and embrace ourselves in the process, the greater opportunity we have actually to rewrite the scripts, to re-pattern and rewire our brain. We heal together through building support systems and allies, both internally and externally. And I think this is what helps us to embrace the process of interrupting all of this. And one of my favorite books that serves as an antidote to this painful superhuman compulsion and this whole inadequacy phenomenon is Brené Brown's book, The Gift of Imperfection. And one of my favorite quotes is, "There's tremendous potential for intimacy and healing when we bring self-love and compassion to the banquet table of being messy and vulnerable." End of quote. I don't know about you, but I never remember seeing a superhero take time for self-care. I don't recall any midday naps, nourishing meals, anything deliberately quiet, taking quiet periods or sitting meditation. My recollection is that each superhero was rushing from one emergency to another. But is that really realistic? And when did the essential need for rest and self-care or quiet time become a sin? Why does self-care actually feel frivolous for so many of us? I hear so many clients say, "Oh, that's selfish. Oh, I don't have time for that." I think it's because it's been marginalized and labeled, rest has been labeled as selfish or unproductive. And yet the irony is it's the most important superpower that we can cultivate individually and collectively, not only to regulate our nervous system, but to enter into a new way of being. And when emotional depletion and physical fatigue are causing conflict in our relationships or sleepless nights or even inflaming health challenges, then isn't that proof enough that we need a reset? I sometimes feel conflicted when I know that I need to reprioritize my life towards a slower pace. That could be less socializing, less technology, more time in nature, and a stronger commitment to my spiritual practices. And along the way, I know that I will disappoint some people, and sometimes I feel judged. But the truth is, I can't afford not to. And it goes against everything that I was trained to believe. Because as a young girl, I thought when things get hard, just keep going, push harder, don't stop. And that belief became part of my inner critic who vehemently suggests that I'm being irresponsible when I slow down and when I rest. And when I need to take care of myself, I sometimes get derailed by this inner critic. Sometimes it's like, but it's sunny outside. You should be out hiking, not taking a nap. What's wrong with you? And I understand it. I understand this aspect of my psyche is just attempting to protect me from a potential threat, of failing in some way. But now it's only up to me to decide if I'm going to reinforce those internal dialogues because I'm the only one that has the power to change. And I know so many of my clients bump into this too. They crave time to slow down. They want to connect with themselves and they want to quiet their minds. And yet, often predictably, as soon as those words slip from their lips, they feel contracted and selfish for wanting to invest in themselves. And sometimes resistance patterns or excuse-making takes over and it paralyzes them. There is a shift occurring, and many of us are growing to understand and honor how important rest is. It's as important as food, water, and connection, or even sleep. So I ask you, what is your process of slowing down, and what does rest mean for you? This is the ongoing inquiry that all of my power reclamation programs are based upon. And so much of my business consulting and leadership coaching is based upon suspending habit, slowing down, and looking at the shadows of our own belief systems. In closing, to support this brave and radical dismantling of the superhuman compulsion, I've created a 30-minute guided meditation called Reclaiming the Power of Rest. And I'll have that available in the show notes. But I also want to mention that I have been offering 30-day meditation, self-empowering practices with groups of people where we gather together to explore the power of suspending habit and learning how to rest. The program is called Traversing the Initiate's Path, and you can learn more about that on my website, which I'll have in the show notes as well. The invitation of the program is both to have accountability around sitting in meditation, but also to learn the power of what happens when we do suspend our habits and we slow things down, and we're in community where we can share and be inspired by one another doing the same. When we slow things down, we do access more of our intelligence and up-level our consciousness and our leadership. So if you feel called, you're welcome to check out this 30-minute meditation. And if you want to take it a step further, you can check out my Traversing the Initiate's Path program. I'll be offering it every 2 to 3 months for 30 days. And as always, if you have any questions or any thoughts, please feel free to send me an email. I love to hear from you. And it's been inspiring to hear your stories and the power of those of you who are really devoted to rebuilding a new world from the inside out. I hope you enjoyed the show today. If you want more, you can subscribe to this channel. This will automatically queue up the next episode for your listening. If you have a burning question or topic you want to learn more about, please send an email to Ask Anne-Marie. The direct link is located in the show notes. And please leave a review. This keeps me inspired and focused to bring you more. If you want to learn more about my work as a power reclamation guide, leadership coach, and organizational culture consultant, you can visit my websites in the notes. Thank you again for joining today.